The film Toni, made in 1934 by Jean Renoir, was not only one of his first truly great films, but it was a landmark in the development of the realist cinema. Renoir, the son of the painter Auguste Renoir, had already made some very interesting and quite successful sound films, the most notable probably being an adaptation of Zola's Nana and a very, very funny military comedy called Tir au flanc. He adapted to sound very well, often working with the actor Michel Simon in films like La Chaîne and Boudou Safe from Drowning. These were terrific films, and he went on to make a film of Flaubert's Madame Bovary. What remains of that film is very special, but unfortunately it was substantially cut by the producers, and it may have been that experience which made him think of doing something different with Toni. Toni came about after a meeting with Pierre Gau, whom he met through their mutual acquaintances like the painters Picasso, Braque, Matisse. And Gau was very taken with Renoir and decided he'd like to make a film. He didn't have enough money to finance the whole film himself, so Renoir suggested they approach Marcel Pagnol, who had his own studios in Marseille. I think the idea was that Pagnol would certainly work on the dialogue and do a lot of the writing, and Renoir would direct. As it turned out, that didn't happen, partly because Renoir's the script, the scenario that Renoir read out to Pagnol was so good they didn't really need anything doing to it. It was a rather interesting development for the script because it was actually taken from a police dossier about a crime that had happened almost a decade earlier, and the dossier was actually compiled by Jacques Mortier, who was a police commissioner in a small town called Les Martigues near Marseille. Mortier was an old school friend of Renoir. They'd been at school together in Nice, and so Renoir worked from that dossier. The film does compress the events of the dossier into a much shorter time scale. They actually happened over a rather long time, and in the film you get the feeling that they're probably happening over a year or so. What really makes the film special, however, is the methods that Renoir chose for making the film. Unlike Pagnol, who of course made films about Provençal life, Renoir chose not to shoot in the studio. He went out on location around Les Martigues and shot largely with non-professional actors. There are some actors in the film, and in fact you can see some of them in Renoir's other films, but many of them were non-professionals. They reflect the multicultural state of life at that time in the region. There were many migrant workers from Spain and Italy especially, but also some from the north. And Renoir chose people who had those accents, who actually did come from those countries, in order to give a real authenticity to the film. Apart from shooting on location and using non-professionals, he also decided to use natural sound. This results in what Renoir himself described as a very primitive film. I think that's a little unfair. It does look a little rough and ready in certain ways, but it has an authenticity and an immediacy and indeed a poetry about it that would not have been achieved otherwise. It also means that it was regarded later as a precursor of the Italian neo-realist films. The realist style of Toni was rather at odds with the sort of boulevard theatre tradition which largely inflected French cinema at that time. Although it wasn't by any means the first French realist film, Renoir had made films that could be described as realist before, though most of them were sort of in a rather comic vein. And Jean Epstein had made a rather sort of important realist film in 1928 called Finis Terrae. But Toni did take it that much further. And it's actually what Raymond Derniat called the first film of his new proletarian period. Renoir's perhaps growing interest in these sort of working classes in this film can perhaps be explained with reference to the rise of the Popular Front in France, with which Renoir was very, very involved, and also as a response to the rise of right-wing ideas and Nazism in Germany. It's very much a look at people who are sort of dispossessed, displaced, and having to sort of get by in a culture that isn't theirs, and certain inequalities in that world. The main character is himself an Italian migrant worker, and this may explain his rather sort of romantic attitude to life, because he falls for a Spanish girl who is also working in the south of France. Unfortunately, she's very popular and also quite open to other suitors as well. And this is the core of the drama, because Toni really can't come to terms with his obsession for this woman. Even after he marries somebody else, he doesn't really know what to do, and it causes great friction. That is basically the drama. That sounds in itself a very non-dramatic story, but it does end with a killing. Now this actually differentiates it from the later Italian neo-realist films, which are supposed to be about everyday stories of everyday people. This is about everyday people, but it's not an everyday story in the sense that it could have been turned into melodrama because there is a murder. But Renoir avoids melodrama by shifting the emphasis away from the big moments of life and onto the small moments of life. It's a beautifully observed film. The fact that he uses non-professional actors in recognisably not beautiful locations, but actually rather industrial locations a lot of the time, this being Provence, gives it an authenticity that would not otherwise be there. It's not a crime drama by any stretch of the imagination, even though it's about a crime. The film differs quite significantly from the Provençal tradition that you get with Pagnol, but also writers like Jean Renoir and Alphonse Daudet. There's no romanticism of Provençal life. This is very much about people going to work on a daily basis, having to trudge around, pushing carts, getting together for not very happy double weddings, and actually just getting on with the struggle of everyday life. The great thing about this is that Renoir loves his characters, and he loves them so much that he loves their faults as well as their virtues. And the hero is a rather silly man and doesn't treat his wife very well in the end because he's so obsessed with this other woman. The other woman is actually slightly flighty and not altogether reliable. The villain of the piece, if we can call him Albert, if we can call Albert a villain, is actually not that unsympathetic. He does some pretty horrible things, but nobody seems to like him. He's not very popular, and we have a certain amount of sympathy for him as well. He's just trying to get by along with everybody else. The realism in this film is actually rather different from the other French realism that came up in the 30s, which was known as poetic realism. This was pioneered by the director Marcel Carné and the writer Jacques Prévert. They made films with people like Jean Gabin, Michel Morgan, and they were very moody depictions of everyday life. In films like Quai des Brumes, the fog itself is a very strong poetic metaphor. Renoir wasn't dealing with such things. It's much more observational as a style. And I think it has a freshness that those other films don't have. It's interesting that this film, on which Luchino Visconti worked, did foreshadow Italian realism in certain ways, but it is quite different, not only in the fact that it's far less sentimental about its working class people. The Italians like to pile on the emotion quite often in those films, full of sympathy for these people. This is full of sympathy, but there's no special pleading going on. But it's also, I think, different in that, in its own rather de-dramatized, non-symbolic, non-metaphorical way, it is actually very poetic. There is a strong sense of nature in this film. It's not beautiful nature. We don't get the picturesque bits of Provence at all. The only time we really see the étang de Beurre, which is a large lagoon, somebody tries to commit suicide in it. We don't get the mountains particularly. We get factories and quarries, and little country lanes, but that's about it. But we get a sense of nature pervading everything. Indeed, the first time we see any real physical connection between Toni and Josefa, the girl of his obsession, is when she gets stung by a bee. Nature is affecting their relationship, even to the point of stinging them into action, I suppose. And Toni has to suck the poison out of her back, which is quite an erotic moment, I suppose. But nature is there all the time, and it's sort of impassive, it's invulnerable. And it's interesting how, for instance, Renoir does use water. It's not presented as a big metaphor, but it's there, for instance, with the suicide. Water was obviously something that turned up in Renoir's films a lot. You have Boudou emerging from the Seine and returning into it at the end. You get the river, of course, later on in Renoir's career. And I think actually the greatness of Toni ultimately lies in the fact that he shows that this drama that takes place, which he's sort of de-dramatized anyway, but he's made it very plausible that, you know, this murder that occurs because of very intense emotions. He's actually shown that even something like that, which is actually a very extraordinary incident in people's lives, is quite a small instant in the flow of life. Of course, another way in which this film differs from the Italian neo-realist films is its use of direct natural sound. The Italian films, even now, they like to use dubbing done after the event of shooting. And it makes a great difference. I've always found a lot of the Italian films quite unreal because of this sound quality. Whereas with Renoir's film, you're getting real voices, people talking in a very natural way, but that's combined with the sounds of life going on around them. And it really gives an immediacy to the film, along with the extraordinarily vivid images, which have a sort of slightly Renoir said he wanted it to be like a documentary, and they do have a slightly documentary feel to them. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the film, which make it feel very modern today. One of the other things that makes the film seem very modern is its attitude towards romance and love, because sometimes Renoir is rather inaccurately regarded as a romantic director. He was a humanist director, certainly, very sympathetic, and he would often deal with the subject of romantic obsession. But Renoir, I think, himself was not a romantic. In many of his films, love and romantic obsession, it's a double-edged sword. It can create great moments of togetherness and strong emotion and ecstasy. But romance itself is a delusional thing. And Toni, in his romantic obsession with Josefa, is basically doomed. He's not necessarily doomed to die, but he's doomed to have his delusion shattered, because Josepha in his mind is not the Josepha in his mind is not the same as the woman, who is actually not devoted to him at all. She's not this idealized creature, but an earthy sexual being with needs of her own. And eventually Toni is going to have to come to terms with that. He never really does, and that's his problem. This is very much a sort of common Renoir creation. You get these romantics in La Règle du Jeu, for instance, people whose rather deluded approach to life and other people is in the end shattered. It's there in a lot of Renoir's work, and I think it is something that makes his films seem very, very realistic and very modern. The key to this film, I think, is that it has a cyclical structure. At the end, we see a scene very similar to the opening prologue. And that, I think, is absolutely key to Renoir's special vision of life. Life goes on, whatever. Nature remains there, whatever we small human people do. And it's an ending that is very, very Renoir-esque. It's an ending that actually anticipates the explicit cyclical statement of the river. And as such, it's the first really mature Renoir film.